Howdy, with this essay, I want to go over essay number 3 on the poetry. Make sure you understand what I'm looking for there. We only have 2 weeks to go. Just want to go over the schedule real quickly. For Monday, response number 9 is due. That's you writing a Shakespearean sonnet. Make sure you look up, if you're not sure what a syllable is and things like that, make sure you do a quick Google search. Understand what's going on there, but hopefully you're having a little fun with that. Then response number 10 is going to be on open forums. Make sure you're watching those videos. Make sure you're getting a sense of how to read poems, particularly from listening to the poets read them. So when you get to essay number 3, you're kind of getting a little used to seeing how to read poems and not just kind of running through it in your head and skimming over it real quickly. Then for Friday the 11th, the first 2 paragraphs of essay number 3 are due. Want to make sure you're on the right track there. There's not going to be a draft submission for this. There's not going to be peer reviews. I'm going to send out a self-review sheet. Hopefully by this point, after all these essays, you should be able to write this essay fairly kind of on your own. I want to make sure you're on the right track. And obviously, if you have questions, I'm here to answer them. But this is one you could hopefully be able to do on your own and do well at it. Once the final versions of essay number 3 come in on Monday, I'll send out the final exam. That'll be due on Wednesday. Response number 11 is just going to be a class survey. Then hopefully I'll be able to get those final grades posted on the 18th, and we'll be done. That'll be the whole semester. And be sure if you have any questions about the schedule to let me know. Also, all late work's due on the 11th, so make sure you're getting that in if you have any late work. For the poetry essay, it's all up here under material for poetry essay on the content page for the course. You're going to see the poetry essay assignment. You're going to see some notes on the poetry terms. Instead of me doing a 20-minute video going over simile and metaphor, I just wrote it out there. Most of those terms you probably know already. If you don't, you can go check out the notes there for more details. There's a sample explication, and also there's a little handout there for how to write good poetry explication, that is. So let's take a look at the essay. This one's a little bit shorter. There's no research involved. It's just you and a poem, and you're going to work with this poem and take us line by line through the poem and show us what you're seeing there. But you're going to write an 800-word explication of one of the following poems, and you're only going to choose one of these. And you have 8 to choose from. It's kind of like death by poison, death by hanging, death by... but hopefully you can read through the poem. Some you look at and go like, no, never. No. But hopefully 1 or 2 you'll kind of go like, oh, I can probably work with this, and then you'll pick one and work with that one poem. And basically, it's your response to the poem. The way some of these poems are structured, you may end up, going stanza by stanza, maybe spinning a paragraph on each stanza. Other ones like Demolition Derby, it's just one long stanza, so you're probably going to go line by line and have to figure out where your paragraphs in your essay are going to break. But overall, the feel should be like you're going line by line through the poem, even if you do a paragraph on each stanza. As you're in that paragraph, you're going to go line by line and take us from the beginning to the end of that essay. To the beginning to the end of that poem. And in terms of critical thinking, the idea is that you're learning to unfold a text a little bit, to develop your ideas about a text, not just summarize it. If you're like me, you like summarizing, and Moby Dick's about a whale or something like that. It's like, well, more to it than that, obviously. But this is a critical thinking skill you need for life. If you get in a position where you have to fire people, you're going to have to explicate why you want that person fired. Are you going to get killed on your unemployment insurance? Businesses pay for that, right? Not the employees. Likewise, if you're an engineer and the bridge falls down, they're going to want to know more than bridge fall down, go boom. They're going to want you to explicate exactly what happened and unfold the events that led up to that collapse of that bridge. Hopefully, nothing that bad happens, but it's a very important critical thinking skill, and we're just applying it to poems here. Some requirements there. No biography. Most of these you can't do it anyway, but like with the William Carlos Williams poem, he's a fairly famous poet. I don't care that he was a medical doctor in New Jersey and did this and that. It's just you and the poem. No biography. No research of any kind. In fact, if I find research, that's a good way to get a quick 0. And there's not a lot of time to redo that essay, right? So please don't start including biography or things like that. Need all the fun punctuation. We'll go over the slash here in a second. I say try and use at least 7 of those poetry terms down there. Some of these you can't. These poems are open form poems. There's no footer, meter, or rhyme scheme. But hopefully you're using metaphor, simile, theme, persona, things like that. Kind of getting used to those terms. No, it, or you. Then you see the poems copied after that. Damp Virginia, late summer. Damp Virginia is a small town in Virginia, and the poem kind of covers what's some events that are going on there. A Woman with Black Balloons, a very good poem, but one where you kind of read and kind of go like, what happened there? What's going on? It's just somebody with balloons. How can you get a poem out of that? Well, she does, and it's a very interesting poem. As you're reading through the poems, when you kind of latch on to one you want to work with, make sure you're going through and looking at all the words. If you need to look up the meaning of words, make sure you do that. When I first read this poem, I had no idea what oomphalus, if that's how you pronounce it, what those are. But actually, it's a very interesting word that she uses there in talking about life and death within the context of the balloons. The Dog of the Night, another one by G.N. Wagner. This one's a little different. You can kind of see with this Woman with Black Balloons, I'll make this kind of small here. You might end up just spinning a paragraph on each stanza here. So you have 1, 2, there's little one-line stanzas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 paragraphs in your explication. But for a poem like The Dog in the Night, where it's just one long stanza, you're going to have to figure out where your paragraphs are going to break. Don't write an essay that's just one long paragraph, right? That's not what essays generally look like. So you're going to have to find the more natural breaks within that poem and figure out how you're going to organize that. But either way, you want to still have that line-by-line feel as you go through the poem. Don't just quote a whole stanza, then summarize stanza, then move on. That's not what an explication does. It goes line by line and unfolds the poem for us and sees where and kind of examines what you're seeing and why you're seeing it. And in a very real sense, this is a reader response type of essay, but it's an informed reader response. You've been in this class all semester. You should be able to have a fairly informed, intelligent response to a poem. Numerology, poets talking about what it's like to turn 7. And all these poems, quite often they kind of seem like, well, okay, I understand what's going on, and all of a sudden something in the middle happens. You're like, what? Dang it, I thought I had an easy poem to work with. The Descent by William Carlos Williams, a fascinating poem. You can see how Williams was very interested in what the poem looked like on the page and kind of working with these indentations and coming back and forth and playing with punctuation a little bit, things like that. Very experimental poem, very interesting poem, very ambiguous poem. You can get through this whole poem and kind of go like, okay, I'm not sure what that meant. But some students just, I like this poem for some reason. And I've had some very good explications on this poem. So, like I said, other students read this and go like, no, never. This be the simile. Be careful, it's a short poem, which means you're going to have to get a lot out of each line. You're going to work a little bit harder to get to that 800 word count. So just because a poem seems kind of easy at first, make sure you're thinking, well, hey, wait a minute, I got to get 800 words out of this explication. And going line by line through through the poem. Demolition Derby by Sherman Pearl. Another poem that's just one long stanza. You're going to have to figure out where the natural breaks in your essay are going to occur. A very interesting poem about Demolition Derby, then bumper cars, and the sun's in there, and all of a sudden you got to try and figure all that out. And the last one, Basic Training. Again, this is another one of those poems that seems pretty straightforward until you get to the middle, and all of a sudden there's another character there, and you're like, oh, well, why's this person here? what all, I thought this was just a poem about basic training, and all of a sudden something else is happening. But those are the poems. Like I said, you may not like some of them. You may just read through one or two and go no, forget it. But try and be open to them, and try and get down to narrow it down to 2 or 3 you might want to work with, and narrow it down to that one you are going to work with. There's that How to Write Good Poetry explication handout on the content page. Make sure you pay attention to that. And like I said, once you finally pick the poem you really want to work with, you might want to print it off so you can annotate on the site. I'm old school. I have to print things off to annotate. You can obviously do that on your computer. But kind of go through the poem, look up words you don't understand, put question marks next to the lines you're not quite sure what's going on there. It's kind of normal, at least in about every poem, to get 1 or 2 lines where you're not quite sure what it means. But once you start thinking about the explication, for this explication, there's different styles of explications, but the one I want you to do, I do not want an introductory paragraph, none of this, since the dawn of history, poetry has fascinated people, none of that stuff. You're going to start with the first line of the poem. You're going to introduce the author, and by introduce, I mean give their names, and that's it. And then get straight to line 1. So no introduction to the poem, no summary of the poem, nothing like that. Just in line 1 of her poem, A Woman with Black Balloons, Jean Wagner says what, and get going with your explication. And you want to start with the first line of the poem, then you want to kind of go line by line through the poem and tell us what you're seeing within the poem. You want to do that in as straight line as possible. Don't get towards the end kind of like, oh yeah, in line 4 they said this. I'm like, well, why are we jumping all the way back to line 4? Don't omit major sections of the poem, or even a whole line from the poem. Most of these poems are fairly short. Going to want to use every line to get to that word count. And it's pretty obvious when you do that, because all of a sudden, as you're using short quotes to support what you're saying, and all of a sudden you skip a couple lines, it's like, well, what happened to those lines? So, don't use I, you, or it. Make sure you have the terms in there. Very important with the explication, make sure you're using frequent short quotes to show us where you're getting your ideas from, to support what you're saying. If you say something like A Woman with Black Balloons is obviously about Obamacare, I'm going to be like, all right, this is going to be an interesting explication, but you probably won't be able to use quotes from the poem to support what you're saying, and your explication is going to kind of fall apart. And we'll tell you about quoting here in a second. But make sure you're using frequent short quotes. Don't try to avoid quoting an entire stanza and then summarizing stanza. That's not what an explication should do. It should go line by line through that stanza or through the poem and show us what you're seeing there. Make sure you stay focused on analyzing the poem. You might have some experience with one of these events. Everybody's turned 7 years old, for example. But it's not about you. It's about your analysis of the poem, right? So I've had students who've been through basic training who kind of talk about that briefly. Then they want to bring us back to the poem very quickly, so we're not getting lost in their personal experience. When you give those short quotes, and you should be quoting quite a bit, make sure you introduce and comment on any quotes you use in your explication. Don't just say there's a metaphor in line 4, quote from line 4, and then move on. It's like, well, what was the metaphor? What we're supposed to get out of this quote. Also, make sure you brackets show changes in the quote, ellipses to show omissions. Those two punctuation become your friend with the explication, because when you're doing all these frequent short quotes, they have to match grammatically with what you're saying, and so the brackets and ellipses kind of help quite a bit with that. For the ending of the explication, you should end with the last line of the poem, maybe one final sentence after that. Don't go back and summarize your explication. Don't go back and summarize the poem. Please don't do that. That's just, also your grade's just going down quickly when you do that. You want a good ending line of your own. Don't, end your essay with a quote from the poem. But no concluding paragraph. So 800 words sounds like a short essay, but when you don't have that introduction or concluding paragraphs, it's all of a sudden it's like, dang, that's, I don't know, you don't really realize how much fluff is, not fluff, but how much of the word count is taken up by introduction and conclusion sometimes. And when you don't have that, it can be a little difficult to get the word count. But no introduction paragraph, no concluding paragraph. And that's what kind of makes the explication kind of a bit of a challenge here. There's a sample explication up there. This one's on a Robert Frost poem. This is in our book somewhere. You can Google it and listen to it on the internet. It's one of Frost's more famous poems. You probably read it before. But if you haven't, you might want to read it real quickly before you deal with the sample explication here. But again, there's no biography on Robert Frost. Don't care that he read a poem at JFK's inauguration, or he did this, or he lived there, or what. Who cares? The whole point of the explication is that you're going to look at this poem and take us line by line through the poem and show us how that poem works and what you're seeing within that poem. So here, in the first stanza of his poem, The Road Not Taken, Robert Frost presents a scene familiar to all people through the persona of a traveler. Our traveler uses first-person narration to present us with the metaphor of two roads diverging in a yellow wood, and then the writer talks about what that metaphor represents, right? When you give a quote, make sure you tell us why that quote's there. Don't just say there's a metaphor there. It did not tell us what the metaphor means. The whole point of this is that you're showing us how the poem works and what's being revealed within the poem. You're unfolding that poem, right? And that's exactly how the beginning of the explication should work. Give the author's name, give the poem title, and get to the first line and get to it. Then the writer's gonna take us line by line through that first stanza, On lines 2 and 3, we find that our traveler must make a choice and cannot remain static. You're going to cite using line number for the poem. So once you decide which poem you're going to use, you're going to have to go through and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for each line. You're not doing it by sentence or anything like that, but the actual line number in the poem. So when you see these citations, that's the line number, not the page number. And it's good to mix it up a little bit, to do some at the end of the quote, some within the introduction, so you're not falling into just a repetitive pattern within your sentences. So here in lines 2 and 3, we find that our traveler must make a choice and cannot remain static. Introduce the quote, the full sentence, so we got a colon there. Then you give the quote. The slash here shows a line break within the poem. You want to show us, it's very important to keep the reader focused on where you're at in the poem, and if you're skipping lines and not having those slashes, it gets a little confusing. The ellipses show that the writer ended the quote before the end of the line, so the person uses the ellipses there, right? So make sure you're using those slashes. Again, brackets and ellipses start becoming your friend pretty quickly. Here, the brackets are used to change the verb a little bit, so it makes more sense with the introduction the writer gives. The persona's point suggests that even if we decide not to choose, we're still heading down a path. And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. You can read faster than I can talk. But notice kind of unfolding the poem, telling us what's happening in that first stanza, using short quotes to support what the writer's saying, and then discussing those quotes once they're giving to continue unfolding the poem for us. Excuse me. When you're looking at your poem, if you find a color, make sure you analyze that color. Woman with black balloons, you got to kind of think, well, what do we use black balloons for? If you've never turned 40 or 50 years old, quite often people take black balloons to birthday parties for people my age. Kind of a joke, but it's also kind of some dark humor there, where you kind of say, hey, you're getting closer to death, right? So when in that poem, The Woman with Black Balloons, when she sees those black balloons, some of that color imagery is coming at her, kind of making her reflect on life and death and things like that. But here in this poem, they're looking at a yellow wood here. So the writers obviously has to talk about what that color yellow is doing within this poem and what it might mean. And again, with this one, this particular poem's in 4 stanzas, so this writer's going to spend a paragraph on each stanza. But again, within that paragraph, you're going line by line through the poem, not just summarizing what the stanza says. Then we go into the second stanza, and again, citing using line number, using the slash to show line breaks when you go from one line to the next, and taking this line by line through the poem. And you can kind of see, and if you have to do a long quote, which is 4 more lines, then you want to offset those over and use the original line breaks, right? Just like we did with verse drama with Oedipus there. But again, you're going to find these brackets help you kind of manipulate the quotes a little bit, make sure they don't change the meaning of the quotes, but they kind of help you fit those into what you're saying, at least grammatically. And I'm not going to read the rest of this to you. You can kind of see what's happening there. But again, citing using line number, slashes for line breaks. And notice when we get to the end, what this writer kind of does is kind of take us back to the title real quickly and say, hey, it's not the road less traveled, it's the road not taken. It's the name of the poem, and there's a reason for that. Quite often this poem, in the writer's opinion, is kind of misinterpreted as by taking the road less traveled, you do these great things in life. But really, the writer's kind of saying that's not how the poem actually works. When you unfold it, when this person has to make a decision, all the roads look exactly the same, right? And you have to pick one and continue on, and then you justify it later on. It's kind of what's going on there. But notice there's no concluding paragraph. The writer doesn't go back and summarize the essay. Please don't do that. Kind of get to the last line and look to get out of your explication. And of course, you need a works cited page. If it's an unpublished poem, you don't need the works cited page. And I'll show you how to do those works cited just once we get there. But if you have any questions about all this, kind of notice with the schedule, excuse me, you're kind of almost working at your own pace a little bit. You want to stay, with the schedule and everything. But if you want to work ahead, there's nothing stopping you. Again, we're not going to do peer reviews. So if you get those 2 paragraphs to me early, I'm happy to take a look at them as early as I can. And you can get this essay done early and finish up a little early if you want to. You might be very busy and just hoping you can make these dates. It's kind of up to you there. But again, if you have any questions, be sure to let me know, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.